Mr. President, to the sponsor, with his kind permission, may I ask basically mostly clarificatory questions?
Gladly, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. My objective in interpellating today is to ensure that there is clarity in the very well-intended bill that is before us today. From my experience, many times when a law is going to be implemented, the lack of clarity becomes a problem only when there's a problem. So I would like to dissect this now to ensure that when the incidents come up, it is already on record, at least in the Senate, what the clear intentions are in the bill. So I will proceed, Mr. President. Definition of terms, employer. Kindly educate this representation. The little that I know is that there could potentially be many employers depending on how a particular show or movie is being developed. Diba? There could be a network, there could be a subcontractor for the lights, there could be a subcontractor for so many other things that I cannot even begin to define. Can we start with educating this representation? What are the subcontractors? Because I'll tell you why I'm asking. I'm asking because at some point, are there subsidiary liabilities? Kasi baka magkaturuan na, hindi ako ang employer niyan, na subcontract yan. So I need to understand so that now pa lang, clear po tayo who will be responsible when we say it's the employer's responsibility.
Command responsibility. Suppliers ang tawag.
So example, habang inaantay ko yung sagot, may bumagsak na ilaw. Is it the I'm repeating it just for the sake of people who are watching us who will want to understand ba't ako nagtatanong ng ganun. So may bumagsak na ilaw. So responsibility ba yun nung network? Responsibility ba yun ni producer? Responsibility ba yun ni Sound and Light Company?
Yeah.
Yun.
Maraming salamat po sa iyong katanungan, Ginoong Pangulo. Tungkol naman po dun sa employer, usually ang movie producers, sometimes they hire suppliers. For example, suppliers ng mga ilaw,
Okay.
suppliers ng mga sound system,
Okay.
cameras,
Okay.
ano pa?
And these people,
Pati mga pagkain.
okay, even the food. And each of these groups would have their own set of employees, correct?
Yes,
So when you say they'll hire somebody sa camera, sa lights, sa sounds, may tao dyan. So let's just say something went wrong. Who is the employer?
The producer is mainly responsible for it.
May subsidiary liability? Do we assume? Because if you ask me, the responsibility falls on the employer, and the one who hired the particular person who may have made a mistake would be the light provider, the sound system provider, by law.
Sagot niya.
So unless they have agreements that says it's the employer, baka kawawa ang nagkiklaim.
Primary what? Primary what? Responsibility. Mr. President, yung producer pa rin yung ang may primary liability with regards to kung ano man ang mangyari sa set, kung nabagsak ka ng ilaw, kung masama ang pagkain, kung hindi gumagana ang...
Saan ho nakasulat yon na yung may responsibility po is the producer? Because if I am the producer, I am going to point to a contract that I signed with these people and say, ikaw ang inano ko ng ilaw, ba't ganyan yung ilaw mo, pumutok? Ikaw ang hinar ko sa sound system, bakit kami nabingi? ikaw yung nag-anong camera, ba't pangit kami sa camera mo?
Maybe,
Whatever.
maybe, Mr. President, you can introduce that in the period of amendments. I would gladly accept it, Mr. President.
So may I request, Mr. President, that is this the Labor Department or the whoever we have consulting be the one to propose? I will be very happy to work with them, but I do not understand the industry well enough. Hindi ho ako expert. I will just point out yung nakikita kong potential gap as a lawyer and lawmaker.
Yes.
Then I can work with them. Kasi ang hirap naman na ako magbigay, tapos yon. So I'll work with them, Mr. President, but may I request na sila po ang magbigay?
Alright.
Now that I've pointed out that there is a potential gap there.
Mr. President, with the indulgence of my two colleagues, in the OSH law that we passed,
Yes.
there
oo
is
nga pala.
supposed to be a safety officer. The safety officer would be the one to ensure that the workplace is safe, Mr. President. So if there's something
That goes wrong.
goes wrong, it is the duty of the safety officer, Mr. President.
And the safety officer is employed by the producers. Oh, so yun naman ang sinasabi po ng ating resource persons. But Mr. President, kung ako din si safety officer, pwede ko naman sabihin na hindi ko naman winawarranty yung products na yan. So,
Yeah.
babalik pa rin tayo dun sa
Yes,
concern
the
ko.
liable will be the employer, the contractor, or the subcontractor. Kasi
That's-
siya yung...
yeah.
Joint-
And that is my point, Mr. President.
Yeah,
We
thank
are, you have,
Joint and
you have also clarified that dun din tayo papunta sa question ko. Who is liable? Sino yung sisingilin?
The producer and the supplier.
So I would suggest, Mr. President, that the lawyers or the labor experts who are assisting us in drafting this would look at provisions regarding subcontracting and clarifying there who has the ultimate responsibility. It could also say that the contract shall specifically provide this or that. No, so it must be clear in the contract so that hindi na ho mahirapan yung sadly yung nasaktan na maghabol, Mr. President.
yes, so your manifestation is well noted, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll move on. Mr. President, letter D, no, I'm still in the definition term, section 4, letter D. It refers to the definition of movie and television industry. Kasama ho ba dito sa movie and television industry yung pagpo-produce ng isang show or whether it's a documentary or an entertainment show that is not in a movie as we know it and a movie house as we know it and not on TV as we know it? In other words, ito pala, sorry, including any related digital medium. I just saw it.
Oh, yeah.
So any,
Yes.
that's clear. Okay. So YouTube,
Yes,
Facebook,
kasama po. Saan po?
even Facebook.
Yes, kasama.
Is there a distinction if it's they're producing 3-minute versions of content? I
Short
don't
film?
mean to be philosopher, Mr. President, no, but I just want to be sure na makover lang talaga.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to it. Like, at what point is it not covered? Meron bang ganon?
They are all covered, Mr. President.
O sige, so podcast. So what if you have a well-known celebrity na kinuhang maggawa ng podcast, tapos, yun, nahulugan ng ilaw or ano man?
Pag nagpa-podcast ka, I'm not techie, no? Pag nagpa-vlog ka, wala ka naman
Mr. President, halatang hindi. Kasi ang podcast hindi ginaganon. Yung podcast, nakaupo ka, tapos nagaganyan ka. Kaya, Mr. President,
So, kung mag-isa ka,
you are
lang, wala
usually
ka
in a
naman...
studio for a podcast,
You do not
usually.
employ any worker, Mr. President. Nag-iisa ka
No,
lang.
no, uso na po ngayon na If I may, no, plug ko na rin kasi kaibigan ko si Mateo tsaka si Sara Gudicelli. Kaka-launch lang nila nung kanilang G Studios. And then nakita ko doon, kasama doon, for podcasters or something. Tama ba? Do you guys remember? I saw that. So and I get it because these people who take their podcasting seriously, ang hirap kasi either, and sorry na lang Bianca Gonzalez, ikikwento kita, pero binisita ko si Bianca one time in her house, then we were having lunch, and then she had to excuse herself because magpa-podcast siya dun sa isang room sa house niya for privacy kasi syempre maingay kami dun sa living room niya. So nung nakita ko yung G Studios na pwede pala doon mag-rent for podcasters, decide ko, oo nga, kasi kung official podcaster ko and you want to expand beyond your bedroom, which is usually where people will do it, makes sense, di ba? So anyway, I'm just throwing this out there for the experts to consider, where do you draw the line?
Well, I'm not a techie person, Mr. President, but if you hire workers, in general, sa podcast o sa vlogging, I think that is already covered.
Yun. Kasi ako, Mr. President, nakita ko rin, nag-umpisa yung vloggers, sila lang, di ba, one-man team. Ngayon yung vloggers mismo, magpo-post na sila, I need a cameraman, I need a ganon. Talagang grabe na yung production level.
Yes, they're already covered by this law, Mr.
Oo,
President.
so
by
covered.
this bill,
Okay.
yes.
So for our viewers, the importance of this question is to now make sure that we have identified that these are all covered. If you hire any worker that somehow contributes to that content you are producing, whether it's audio and visual or it's just one or the other, covered. Okay.
As long as you hire workers, Mr. President.
As long as you hire workers. Okay. So may I just also point out that the definition of worker should now be likewise modified or considered along with the proposal I said in Section 4A when we define who is the employer. Kasi Section 4E refers to worker, any person engaged or hired by the employer or principal. So I'm just saying that has to now be related. Who is the employer? Just to make sure that we cover that as well, Mr. President. Next item. Section 5. I don't have any questions, Section 5. Section 6, it's okay. Section 7, my question is, okay. May I know why it is deemed important to include the phrase lack of verification or acknowledgement from a notary public does not affect the validity? Kasi wala naman, I'm not aware that it is a requirement. So by putting it here, maybe I'm not aware of some kind of practice in the industry that requires that it is now indicated.
Mr. President, thank you for that comment. The phrase that you mentioned, the lack of verification or acknowledgement from a notary public does not affect the validity or enforceability of the agreement or employment contract. As long as there is an agreement, maybe, Mr. President, we can delete.
Kasi the basic
we can
definition of a
delete this
contract
phrase
is a
already.
meeting of the minds.
Yes, yes.
And you have it in writing as proof of the terms that you agree upon. So
Yes.
I
agree
just
with you.
don't want na
We-
makagulo pa ho ito.
Yes.
And we also are
in due time,
establishing
in
it
the
now.
period of amendments, we will
Okay, thank
delete
you.
this particular phrase, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Paano sa individual
Sige,
amendment?
dito na po tayo sa Section 9 on some of the terms and conditions of employment. So, My understanding of this whole provision is this, Mr. President. The normal work hours is 8 days.
8
hours,
hours.
sorry.
Yeah.
8 hours. So pag walang sinabi sa'yo, understood yon 8 hours, no? Parang sa ibang opisina. Normally, they'll say you're 9 to 5 or 10 to 6. So we are also not indicating what time it starts, right? Basta we're just establishing that the normal work hours is 8 hours. Is that correct?
Yes, but as I've mentioned earlier, in the movie industry, this is a unique industry, Mr.
Correct, of
President.
course.
Hindi naman pwede na, 8 to 5 ka or 9 to
Yes.
6 ka. Hindi naman pwede sa mga sa industriya ng pelikula to, Mr. President.
So why do we have to say this now? Because I think, I also just came from a shoot that ended at 3 a.m. last night. Iniwan ko si Alan doon, buhay na buhay pa
What time
ako.
did you start, Mr. President?
Our call time was 12
12 in the afternoon?
noon
And you finished at 9
at 3.
in the morning?
Well, I got home at 3:30, so 3:24
So
to
that's
be
15
exact. So
hours?
siguro mga 2
That's 15
something.
hours?
Mga ganun. We started mga 3, siguro 12 hours kami. Pero, yun nga, again, there for makeup and, yeah, anyway. But anyway, my point is, do you even want to say what the normal work hours is? Because you're telling me it's not normal. So,
Yes.
why do we have to say it's the normal?
This is a unique industry.
Wag natin lokohin yung sarili natin. Kung hindi yan yung normal, wag natin sabihin it's the normal. Hindi pala yan yung normal.
Hindi kasi ang intention itong minimum of 8 hours and in-extend natin a maximum of 14 hours. Kasi unang-una, upon the consultations that we've been through, ito yung reasonable hours of work. Kasi
Of
pag
course.
ilalagay mo ng 8 hours lang or 10 hours lang or normal work hours ng 8 hours, malulugi po yung mga producer. Kasi syempre, hindi nila ma-maximize
Yeah, I understand.
yung oras
I understand. I understand.
ng ating mga
Yeah, because yung pag-setup mo pa lang, baka
artista.
4 hours
Correct.
na yun. Alangan namang 4 hours na
Correct.
lang. I really understand. I'm just asking how the reality is reflected in the way we wrote it. Yun lang naman yung nature ng mga tanong ko eh. Kung hindi pala normal yung 8, baka dapat sabihin natin the usual, the intended, or I don't know. I don't know. I'm just trying to reflect here what is the norm talaga. But my staff na ang lakas bumulong dito sa likod ko is correctly pointing out that the reason you want to establish 8 hours is because overtime pay or differentials will kick in based on the 8 hour. Tama ho ba yun, Mr. President?
Tama po kayo, Mr.
Ayun,
President.
okay. So that's why it's important to establish 8 hours kasi may benefits na pumapasok within that 8 hours. Okay. So I will do my homework also and not bother His Honor with those to be sure na clear sa atin what kicks in within 8 hours and what kicks in within 14. May difference ba? And it's also something I would like His Honor to ask the experts, the consultants, para clear tayo. Unless the intention is not to be clear. Kasi natatawa ho ang sponsor. So, gusto ba nating hindi tayo clear? So, kunyari, meals. And I remember reading something about meals or overhearing about meals. And overheard pala from Senator Grace po. Meron ba tayong something here that how many meals do you feel within the regular hours? Therefore, we're referring to the 8? Paano nga
Usually,
kung umabot ng 18?
if they start at 6 o'clock, they have to serve breakfast. 6 o'clock in the morning, they have to serve breakfast.
Yeah.
And lunch.
Yeah.
Pag umabot ng
Dinner.
dinner, may merienda pa yan, di ba? Meron pang snacks.
Is that a non-issue, Mr. President, such that there's no need to...
No,
Because
that is a non-issue.
non-issue.
Talagang regular na ginagawa
Okay.
ng mga movie.
So I won't belabor the point if they are non-issues. Kumbaga sa pagkain, wala
Yeah,
namang
walang
nagrereklamo
issue
sa
yan, yes.
pagkain.
Standard SOP yun. Pati nga sa midnight snack, pag umabot ng alas 12 na madaling araw, meron din silang midnight snacks, Mr. President.
Mr. President, this is a general principle similar to Senator Joel Villanueva's, no? Existing laws that protect workers would continue to be effective and followed unless they are specifically amended or repealed under this law. Is that correct? Under this bill when it becomes a law?
Supplementary, Yes, you are correct, Mr. President.
Because,
Labor
Mr.
code.
President, my expanded breastfeeding law has very clear provisions on allowing women who are lactating or breastfeeding their babies to continue to breastfeed in the workplace. So, unless there is anything contrary, and I just assume that all of this will continue to be observed.
Yes, that will be continued. It will be continued to be observed, Mr. President.
I would like to appeal to the entertainment industry to actually, and it would be wonderful if they could be even more generous with the hours provided to those defined as workers, whether they are actual performers or behind the scenes, because as His Honor, who is my batchmate, will recall and will remember from experience, I'd like to believe that we get better as we age, not us individually, but as an institution. And at the time I pushed for that bill, ang hirap din ipaliwanag yung kahalagahan ng breastfeeding. So, ang nailaban ko lang doon is 40 minutes for every 8 hours. I was a working breastfeeding mom. If you only breastfeed 40 minutes in 8 hours, magkakasakit ka. Alam ni Senator Robin yan dahil nag-breastfeed ang kanyang asawa, di ba? Ang sobrang sakit nun. But ang gagawin namin ng mga working moms is pati yung lunch break namin, magbe-breastfeed kami doon. Kung anong takas na pwede mong gawin, magbe-breastfeed ka. I had the luxury of being employed in a law office na I have my own time. So I could express my milk pump, in other words, anytime I want. Nasa sa akin na yun sa pag-manage ko sa clients ko. But not everybody has that luxury nga. So maybe I can just hear from the practitioners in the industry how they can make breastfeeding in the entertainment industry a beacon of exemplary support for breastfeeding mothers, Mr. President.
Yes, I will. Talk to the members of the movie industry and to give importance to your advocacy, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Advocacy po ng lahat ng kababaihan at ng mga katulad niyong very supportive husband. Including ng majority floor leader natin. Okay, Mr. President, again, to clarify, I'm still in hours of work, section 9. So when we have a provision that says it shall be applicable to all workers except for the following. Yung workers age 60 and above who shall be allowed under exceptional circumstances as defined by the Tripartite Council. Ano kaya yun? I'm just curious because we need to give the delegation of powers, undue delegation of powers principle requires that our law is clear to the delegated authority kung papaano sila gagawa ng bagong rules nila. So, hindi tayo pwedeng bahala na kayo, Tripartite Council, kung ano yung exceptional circumstances. Dapat may basis sila kung bakit sila nag-agree because we are now creating an exception. Having said that, I know very fit and healthy 60 years old that will not want an exception. But, of course, that is here precisely because we want to recognize that there may be a need for exceptions.
According to my consultants in the movie industry is concerned, Mr. President, some of our directors, or most of our directors, the movie directors, are already in their twilight years or
Okay,
senior
okay.
citizens.
Okay.
And hindi naman po pwede yung 8 hours lang kayo, 8 hours lang sila magtatrabaho dahil sa tingin namin, sa mga kilala namin mga direktor, ay kaya pa rin nila magtrabaho hanggang
Of course. And I
14
support
hours,
that.
Mr. President.
So kaya nga, pero Mr. President, ang tanong ko was not why are they given exceptions. Hindi yun. I truly believe that many people can have productive lives, 70s, 80s, even 90s. Pero ang tanong ko is, what is the basis for the exception? Kasi si Tripartite Council will be the one to give that exception. It is our duty as lawmakers to provide the standards for them to give the exception. Otherwise, it's possible that this would be undue delegation of authority. So ano yun? Is it simply saying that they need a doctor's health certificate? Kung yun lang yun, di yun lang yun, sabihin na lang natin na yun lang yun. Nagulat ako kasi na ba't tripartite council pa eh. Baka medical certificate lang. So to be clear, yes, go
In
ahead.
Section 9, Mr. President, I would like to invite the attention of my colleague here. Section 9, letter A,
I.
subsection I.
Yes.
It says here, provided that the said worker voluntarily executes a separate agreement in the proper form prescribed by the Department of Labor and Employment, Mr.
Yes,
President.
Mr. President, I know and I've read that. But it doesn't tell me ano nga yung exception. Yun nga yung tinatanong ko. Because to be clear, for it to be considered a due delegation of legislative power, it should be complete in itself. The law should identify bakit tayo nagbibigay ng power dito to decide. And then number two, it must fix a standard which limits, which is easy to determine kung pasok sa standard yung didesisyonan nitong entity na to, which is the Tripartite Council. Because me, to keep it simple, I would just say that they have a doctor's certificate and they testify that they are fit to work. That's what I would say. But gusto nyo daan sa Tripartite Council, then explain to me what will the Tripartite Council do and say to allow a 60-year-old to work.
May I ask for a minute suspension, Mr. President?
Session suspended.
Hindi naman to tanong na sa akin eh. Hindi nga kasi ito. Hindi ito yung tanong niya eh.
Sige, basahin ko pag sinopla na naman ako nito. Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session.
Mr. President, I would like to thank my distinguished colleague, Senator Pia Cayetano, for her very enlightening questions. As discussed with the stakeholders concerned of the industry, Mr. President.
Mr.
and the-
President, sorry, may I just ask the level of noise to be lowered because I cannot hear the distinguished sponsor that well. Thank you.
May we ask our colleagues in the back to settle down as we have started session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. As discussed with the stakeholders of the industry and the Department of Labor, we will just propose an amendment to the bill by deleting Section 9, letter A and subsection I, no? Since the intent really is to allow workers aged 60 years old and above to work beyond 8 hours, but in no case exceeding 14 hours, Mr. President.
I leave that to the discretion of the sponsor if they would like to delete it. Just to be clear on the part of this representation, I am not aware that there is any law that prohibits a 60-year-old from working. Therefore, there would really be no need no legal need to provide an exception unless by the nature of the work it is very taxing. Then I think it would benefit the employers, whether it's the producer or whoever, for everybody's mutual protection to get a medical certificate.
Yes, I agree. I
Yun
totally
lang naman
agree
po,
with you,
Mr.
Mr. President. Yes.
Oo. And then, Mr. President, the reference to tripartite council should be clarified. If tatanggalin na po yun, then wala nang role si tripartite council in allowing a 60-year-old and above, a senior, to work. However, I will quickly jump to Section 22 that refers to the tripartite council. And may I just request that the membership be clarified? Because normally when you say a tripartite council, you identify who is in the tripartite council. And dahil po tri, di tatlo po yun. Eh wala naman hong nakasulat kung sino yan. So maghuhulaan ho tayo and baka naman with all the stakeholders, many would like to be a part. I can only speak for, let's say, the health industry. We have health workers. We have non-health workers. And then we have the industry leaders or yung mga employer. So sino ho yan dito? I don't need a reply now, but it's just...
Well, first of all, it's the producers, the employers, and a representative from the workers and the Department of Labor, Mr. President.
okay. So perhaps that can... So the producers ask the employer.
Yes.
And then the employees...
Workers.
The workers. But would you distinguish between who would be representative of the worker? Is this those in front of the camera or behind the camera? Again, I'm just pointing it out for clarity.
Behind the
And then the third is Dole. That has to be identified, Mr. President.
Yes,
so
Mr.
there's
President,
no-
maybe in the crafting of the
Yeah.
IRR, Mr.
Ay,
President.
parang hindi yata, Mr. President. I think that is too important to leave to the IIR. Because, Mr. President, as the example I've seen, nag-delegate po ng power under Section 9 sa Tripartite Council. You cannot delegate that power na we don't even know who would be the members there, Mr. President.
Ano yung, sino yung mga, sino yung representative ng workers? What's IJ? Interguild Alliance. Yeah. Ito yung sa workers.
Film Academy at saka IGA, Interguild Alliance.
Ay,
G as in golf. Interguild Alliance.
ayan. Well, Mr. President, the workers will be represented by the IGA or the Interguild Alliance or the Film Academy, Mr. President. Ano ito? If I may add, Mr. President, just to enlighten my dear colleague, ang ibig sabihin po ng Interguild Alliance, Mr. President, ito yung mga taong behind the camera,
Nice,
like for
okay.
example, yung mga production designers,
So,
yung mga scriptwriters,
Okay.
yung mga
Set designer, tama ba?
set designer, yung mga director. Ito
And is there only one kind of association for these people?
There are a lot of associations, Mr. President.
But His Honor
Meron
mentioned
tayong
the Interguild
Directors
Alliance.
Guild, Actors Guild.
Correct. But are these guilds are these all members of this Interguild Alliance?
Yes, Mr. President. Some are, yung Film Academy. Kasi, Mr. President, marami ho kasi mga
Eh, yun-
organisasyon
Then that's
na
why.
mayroong mga paksyon-paksyon.
Correct. I understand. Naintindihan po natin yon. Pero if we are now going to identify that one of the members of the tripartite agreement is one particular association, then we would effectively be excluding the others. So that would be my concern lang po. Kasi meron akong narinig dito sa audience na ay may iba. So we have to pass something that is truly inclusive, Mr. President.
Maybe there should be a dialogue maybe between the Interguild Alliance and the other group, itong Film Academy of the Philippines, to choose their representative for the Tripartite Council, Mr.
Sige.
President.
Anyway, I leave that point, Mr. President, only to point out that if there are very specific tasks being given to this tripartite council and we cannot form the membership, then those tasks will not get done. I don't know what else is there because aside from Section 9, maybe there's something else here. I'll ask my staff also and maybe the resource persons can point it out so that we know what is affected by the choice of these members, Mr. President. I'll move on. I just wanted to point that out. So I'll go through the other letters. Work hours include waiting time where the worker is required to stay.
Are we
within
going back, Mr. President?
No, we're not going back, Mr. President. I was in Section 9A. I am now in Section 9B.
9B?
Yes.
I thought you jumped to Section 20.
No, only because the tripartite council
Okay,
mentioned
okay.
in 9AI is defined somehow vaguely in 22. Pero ito lang naman yung main concern ko, Mr. President, Section 9.
Okay.
So clearly, work hours include waiting time, and then letter C, time during which work is required to. Okay. D. Are the workers, both those in front of the camera and behind the camera, uh, uh, are they amenable to Section D? Okay ba sa kanila
Section
na
D?
9D? Yung schedule shoot, if a scheduled shoot is canceled less than 8 hours immediately preceding, all workers engaged shall be compensated. Okay ba sa kanilang 8 hours? Because pag ako po may 8 a.m. at tinawagan ako ng alas 12, hindi po okay sa akin yun. Dahil sira na yung buong araw ko, dahil yung alas 8 ko, may iba sana akong ginawa. Natulog sana ako, nag-workout sana ako, may iba sana akong appointment, may date, you never know.
Well, upon
So-
consultation with the members of the industry, I think they are amenable to it, Mr. President.
Amenable? Amenable daw. Really? Not
Thumbs
sure,
up
Mr.
sila.
President, ha? Kasi I'm just speaking for myself. 8 hours isn't a lot. And again, it's not my industry, but I'm just mindful na medyo mahirap yung 8. I leave that up to the stakeholders to decide. Kasi that is a practical matter that must be decided by the stakeholders. I am simply pointing it out for the sake of a robust and lively exchange of ideas. Next point, letter E. Ayun. Mr. President, dito pumapasok si letter E, 9E, dun sa tanong ko kanina na ano ba ang ibig sabihin ng normal work hours na 8 hours? Kasi nga, in 9E, we identified that work rendered beyond 8 hours shall be compensable with overtime pay. That's really the reason why that 8 hours is being identified, I believe, Mr. President. Unless a more favorable rate or fee is stipulated in the contract. So, Mr. President, to be clear, at least for talents, and when I say talents, sinabi bang talents? Sorry,
Extra.
forgive me. Ha?
Extras yun. You refer to the extras as talents right now.
Okay. So anyone in front of the camera na lang, 'di ba? So regardless of your billing, tama ba yung aking pag-explain? Anyone in front of the camera, do they normally get a fixed rate that is would fall under letter E, meaning unless a more favorable rate or fee is stipulated? Is that common?
Favorable to the workers. Mr. President,
There is going to be an exciting response because the
Yes,
sponsor is smiling.
I was
Surprised.
also a movie producer
Okay.
way back, and for me, I value the work of our workers behind the camera, and in Section E, this is always favorable to the workers, Mr. President. Kasi ang ano yun? Minimum wage natin right now is 610 pesos, and they are being paid around minsan doble na po, Mr. President. 1,500
Kaya nga,
a day, no?
precisely why, Mr. President, precisely why I asked that is it the norm that the rate that is usually given to workers, and I specifically mentioned in front of the camera, pero dagdagan natin, in front, behind, if it's beyond, is that the intention? If it's beyond minimum wage, then therefore they would not fall under this, because that's not what it says. So I'm trying to clarify this.
So, ano tinatanong?
Yun ba yung point na pag binigyan ka namin ng beyond minimum wage, you will not fall under the, because that's the answer that's being given to my question, is it the norm that the rate given is negotiated, therefore hindi nakasama itong overtime pay?
No, that's not the question of Senator Pia. Ang question, Senator Pia, kung nabayaran mo na beyond the minimum wage, are they still applicable dito sa law? so. May we seek for a minute suspension?
Session suspended.
Okay na? Okay na? Okay na to? Ha? Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session resumed.
Thank you, Mr. President. With regard to the question of our dear colleague, Senator Pia, Section 9, letter E, tama? Subsection E. In general, Mr. President, the workers receive wages that are higher than the prevailing minimum wage rate plus overtime pay. Usually, parang package po ito, Mr. President. And I think this provision is needed to protect workers who are in small independent films, Mr. President. Minsan po kasi pagkain na yung binabayad sa kanila, kaya kailangan natin ng provision na ito, Mr.
course.
President.
Of course. And the reason I asked, Mr. President, precisely is to avoid that kind of confusion. When His Honor's reply is, it's normal in the industry to provide a rate that, number one, is more than above minimum wage, and then you added that it includes overtime pay, that should be very clear. Because
Yes.
otherwise, by law, if you are a regular worker, you are not a supervisorial or a managerial worker, by law, you must receive a overtime pay.
Yes.
So kung kasama na yon, then I suggest that it is very, very clear para wala nang turuan. Yun lang
Yes,
naman.
Mr. President, according to the computations that they made a while ago, if you're being paid 725 pesos, huh? If you're being paid 1,000, less than 1,200 pesos, say 1,100 pesos, you're being paid the minimum wage plus the overtime. Itong mga binabayad po natin mga producers dito sa ating mga malilit na manggagawa ay lagpas pa ho dun sa sinasabi kong figures, Mr. President. Sometimes they pay them 1,200, 1,500 pesos a day. So, sakop na po yung overtime pay dun sa binabayad nila, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Exactly why I was just asking, what is the practice in the industry? Because this Section E states the standard, and then unless, sabi dito, unless a more favorable rate or fee is stipulated. So His Honor is explaining that, in fact, there are more favorable rates that are stipulated in
Yes.
their contracts. So, okay din naman maipaliwanag to para walang confusion. I'll move on, Mr. President. Letter G, travel to and from out-of-town projects shall be compensable, provided that the worker cannot gainfully utilize the travel time for one's own personal purpose, need, or benefit. So if you're on a let's say yung inyong shoot is in Baguio and you're on a 4-hour trip, yung 4 hours na yun is considered compensable work hours, right? Ano kaya, Mr. President, yung unless the worker, provided that the worker cannot gainfully utilize the travel time? Pagka ba, I'm being philosopher, Mr. President, no, but I just don't want there to be any misunderstanding here. So kung nakasakay ka doon, papunta, and then you're listening to your favorite music, are you utilizing the travel for your own personal benefit, or clear yun that that's compensable?
Kasi minsan po, itong ating mga workers, minsan pag imbis na didiretso ka sa shooting location, halimbawa, ang location mo ay papunta kang Baguio,
Duman ng La Union.
Nag-detour ka pa, punta ka La Union, nag-beach ka pa, or whatever.
So yung part na yon hindi.
Yes.
O, kasi yan at yun din ang binubulong nitong mga staff ko, baka kasi mag-detour. So that's exactly what we're talking about para clear. So if you compute that it's only now 3.5 hours by NLEX, ECTEX, and TIPLEX to get to Baguio, pag dumating ka doon ng 6 hours, yung 2.5 mo hindi kasama. Di namin alam
Yes.
kung saan ka napunta.
Correct.
Okay, I'm just clarifying, Mr. President, para clear. And then, Mr. President, Section 10 na tayo. Transportation expense or service, whichever is applicable, to and from out-of-town project shall be at the expense of the employer or principal. Whose choice, Mr. President? Can a
Teka,
worker, yeah, go ahead.
Kung wala pong sasakyan yung artista, halimbawa, the producers will provide
Correct.
the vehicles.
Pero I mean, yun nga,
To transport them.
if any worker, whether artista or any other worker, may sariling kotse, pwede siyang humingi ng kabayaran na lang ng kanyang sariling gasolina? Does it matter if it's a diesel or regular?
Well, if they want to use their own car, you have to charge it to your own expense,
yun,
Mr.
kaya nga
President.
nililiwanag ko nga, Mr. President. So, kasi sabi dito, transportation expenses or transport whichever is applicable. That's why I'm saying you should clarify if it's only one who has the choice. If the choice is only with the employer, para walang misunderstanding, sulat nyo dito.
But they are also ready to provide service vehicles, Mr. President.
Yes,
Ito mga
that
producers.
seems to be clear, Mr. President. But again, my example is, if gusto nilang magdala ng sariling sasakyan,
Sila
then
magbayad ng gasolina
sila
lang,
magbayad-
Mr.
That's
President.
not clear here. That's what I'm saying, Mr. President, para
Okay.
clear. Thank you, Mr. President. So, I think, Mr. President, the only other clarification na lang, and I no need to respond, you can just give me the response later about the insurance.
Yeah.
I just want to be clear that it's very clear what kind of insurance, because you cannot double insure someone, as far as I know. Therefore, if somebody has their own insurance, and then the employer will also provide. I don't know how it works. I just don't want there to be a problem.
Usually, it's a accident insurance, Mr. President.
Accident pala.
Yes,
Okay. Okay. Which is usually not included in a regular HMO kasi
Correct.
accident.
Yes, Mr. President.
So this is very specific dun sa industry, no? Ganun talaga. Okay.
Dati po, wala pong nung panahon ho namin, wala naman kaming insurance. Because of the untimely death of Mr. Eddie Garcia, dito lang natin in-improve na magkaroon tayo ng insurance benefits para sa ating mga workers. Because before, we never had any insurance.
So again, Mr. President, I think this also has to be clarified. See Section 12 on Social Security and Welfare Benefits. It states, the workers shall be covered by the Social Security System, Home Development Mutual Fund or Pag-ibig, and the Philippine Health Insurance Corporation, PhilHealth. The payment of SSS, Pag-ibig, and PhilHealth contribution shall be jointly shared by the worker and the employer, when applicable, in accordance with existing rules and regulations. That's where, Mr. President, again, it has to be defined, to be clear, who is the employer? Because I'm not aware, and it may just be my own ignorance, pag short-term yung project, meron bang SSS na short-term? Parang wala akong, meron ba? Hindi, iba yun. Because if you're an independent contractor, yung self-employed ka, then nagko-contribute ka ng SSS when PhilHealth mo ng sarili mo. So, pag na-hire ka for a project, tapos may employer ka, mag-change yung status mo, kailangan lang clear tayo kung paano maro-roll out to. And again, is it the subcontractor or is it the producer? Di ko maisip na lilipat lahat ng responsibility nun sa producer, which is what was relayed earlier on the floor.
Kasi baka unrealistic na yung provisions. Paano ba siya i-handle? Yung last 30 is yung mga laws affected dun sa mga election.
Hindi na, doon na lang sa amin.
Minute suspension, Mr. President.
Session suspended.
Kaya nga, i-click. Ready to resume, Mr. President. Walang tao. Wala.
Session is resumed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Section 12 is simply saying that if there is an employee-employer relationship, the contribution shall be jointly shared by the worker and the employer. Meron po kasi mga regular employees sa industriya, Mr. President. And in case of the independent workers, katulad ng mga talents, mga artista, they shall be paying voluntarily, Mr. President.
Okay. Mr. President, again, I raise the confusion as to who is considered the employer in this case, which I will just ask His Honor to respond to in the period of amendments, just for for clarity, because earlier the response given was that the employer, the term employer refers to the producer. But I'll give you an example, Mr. President. For example, a light and sound subcontractor has 5 regular employees that pinasok nila ngayon for this project. So kung regular employees ni light and sound contractor yon, malilipat yon dun sa producer? Because based on the earlier statement, the producer is the employer. Earlier in the general discussion on the definition of who is an employer. That's why, Mr. President, I'm clarifying.
Well, it is still the supplier who will pay. It will still be the supplier who will pay for the contribution, Mr. President. Not the
producer.
Movie producer, Mr. President.
Yeah, I think, Mr. President, we can have more clarity in the definition of employer when it comes to who is responsible for liabilities in terms of injury in the workplace, and then who is responsible in terms of workers' compensation and benefits. Kasi nga po, as I mentioned, the little I understand about the industry is may subcontractors. And there's already an employer-employee relationship with the subcontractor and their employees. So, gusto ko lang naman na hindi magkaroon ng confusion in the implementation of this law, Mr. President. So, the sponsor is saying now that the subcontractor is considered the employer who will make the contributions of the employer, right, for the benefits, itong
Yes,
SSS Pag-ibig. But earlier, when we talked about liabilities, the response was it's the producer who would have liabilities. So maybe we can distinguish later on, even during the period of amendments, liabilities ng ng work-related injuries. Yeah, because so that a worker would know sino yung sisingilin niya. In what instance ang sisingilin niya is yung direct employer niya, which is the subcontractor, and in what cases, if any, ang producer yung sisingilin. I do not know the industry enough to imagine all those possible scenarios, but there are scenarios which I feel we need to visualize so that strong ang batas natin, Mr. President.
Yes,
Yun lang
Mr.
naman.
President. We will specify it during the period of amendments, Mr.
Yeah.
President.
or I'm more than happy if the resource persons would like to sit down with our team. We're happy to map out those scenarios to be sure we covered everything. Mr. President, that's all for today. Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much
Mr.
for your
President.
patience. May I just say that His Honor has always been
welcome.
very gracious and patient when we go through this process of crafting these bills. It's a process that he is an expert of, having been with me since 2004. I know it can be tedious, but His Honor is very used to this. There's many other bills that he sat through with questions that are harder to answer than the questions I ask. So I don't need to ask His Honor for his indulgence, because by nature he is very indulgent. Maraming salamat po.
And how can I refuse a beautiful senator like you, Mr. President? Thank you, Mr. President.